And again, the big question is, can we determine not just what the malware was based on its hash or whatever it does, can we determine what the exploit was? Certainly we can figure out lots of related things, again, the hash of the file that was dropped and the events that led up to that from a high level, but again, can we drill down and figure out what was the exploit? So how do we begin this journey to figure out what was it that exploited our browser? Well, first you can look for large HTML files. If there's only a couple HTML files, you might be in luck. It may be pretty easy to figure out what was going on, and if it's not too obfuscated, you might be able to figure out how it works as well. But if there's many HTML files and they're highly obfuscated, that can make this really difficult. Also, you could look for jar files if there's maybe only one or two Java files and it looks like they were, directly called from one of these straightforward HTML files. Maybe again, it's pretty easy to figure out, this was this Java exploit. Same thing with Swift files. We see them quite a bit. There may be lots of them from ad banners and whatnot, but again, if there's only a couple and they're not too obfuscated, it might be straightforward. And if it's not, we're going to have to dig in and de-obfuscate it. Now, the other thing, of course, and I'll talk about this later, is we can follow our database trace file too and figure out, okay, before this file was dropped, what happened? We were executing a Swift file, and before that we were executing a HTML file. So we can also, if there's lots of different files, we can begin to get an idea of the sequence of events too. So the sad reality is exploit and malware authors are often going to obfuscate their stuff. And so I've got some tools I want to talk about. The first ones are to de-obfuscate and beautify HTML and JavaScript. One is called JS Detox. Another is called Cerebro Profiler. And I've got a picture of Cerebro here. It's a commercial tool, which is the unfortunate bit there if you're on a budget. JS Detox, on the other hand, is free, but it's a little bit of a pain to set up. I tried to set it up in a Windows environment and failed because it requires a version of the V8 JavaScript engine and just couldn't get it working on Windows. I don't even know if it does. I think it's supposed to, but it didn't seem to in my setup. So I did actually get it going in Linux, and I'll show it to you as a demo there. And that works, pretty good there, but it's not perfect. None of these are perfect. They still may fall down if the obfuscation is too obfuscated or obfuscated in some way that they're not familiar with. It still might not, be super helpful in cleaning up. But we'll take a look at the tools and see what we can do with them. So if there's a Java file, bytecode viewer is one of the tools that I prefer. And I like this one because it gives you a number of different compilers you can choose from. You can get kind of a side-by-side view because the different decompilers will mess up on different things. So it's nice to have some options, nice to have some side-by-side view to see how things look in different decompilers. And you can also see the bytecode in there in case the decompilers totally mess up as well. Certainly there's other tools. I'm just giving you some recommendations. Now when it comes to Swift files, JPEG's Free Flash Decompiler is the one that I've used before. It's free, which is great, and you can use it to decompile, dump the action script. You can even use it to debug, and presumably it's got a new feature called Edit, which allows you to edit and redebug. The edit didn't seem to work too well for me, but at least the dumping and the debugging seem to work pretty good, so that's a pretty solid tool. So here's a quick screenshot of a recent Flash exploit in the Free Flash Decompiler. And we can see it's pretty nice at displaying the action script, and you're able to run it and debug it. Again, you want to make sure you're in some kind of a safe environment, a virtual machine for sure, before you obviously run code that may be malicious. But it's a pretty good tool for what it does. So what files are in the case study that we're going to take a look at? Well, there's 1,412 files, and that's kind of a lot for a typical Lava event. May not usually have quite that many. There's 92 HTML or JavaScript files, and that's a lot too, especially if they're big or obfuscated or whatever. There's only 2 Swift files, and there's no jar files, so that's good news. So one of the things we might want to do, considering all the larger numbers of other files, is just start with a Swift file. And one of them looks like an ad, and we'll take a quick look at it, but probably that's normal. And the other one, maybe that's the malicious one, if in fact Swift was the exploit vector. Now the other thing that gives us some confidence that this limit Swift is possibly the one we're after is that it happens just before a sequence of events that led to the malicious executable getting dropped. So we see that nearby in the chain of events, which is another good sign that this may be part of the exploit vector. Unfortunately, when we look at the highlights of the DEVTS, which is part of a lava event, it gives us some great detail in terms of understanding the sequence of events that IE Explorer was exploited, presumably somehow. Then there's some conhosts, which probably just like basically command shell type things happening. So red service called on a certain DLL, and then another executable, another blah blah blah. So we can see the sequence of events in terms of the actual malware getting installed, and we can put that temp file, which is actually an executable, into VirusTotal, for example, and figure out which malware it is and stuff. So we got a real good head start on figuring out what the malware is. But again, here we're trying to figure out what the exploit is. So what happens between IE doing its last thing before it does this malicious command? So let's take the ad and put it in the Flash decompiler, and it looks pretty normal. It doesn't look particularly obfuscated. It doesn't look particularly interesting. And so just like we thought, this probably is not the one. On the other hand, when we put the limit flash file into the decompiler, it looks ugly. It looks obfuscated. It looks like it's intentionally made to be difficult to read. So that could be another sign that this is the one we're after. So one of the ways we can begin is we can dump the ActionScript files out of it, and we could maybe come up with some Python scripts or tools to try to beautify this, or maybe there's some other automated tools out there that we could find and use to beautify ActionScript. But there's the files aren't really all that big, and a lot of the obfuscation is basically just variable and function name hiding. So like this 11111 is some function name or whatever. So we can just do a find and replace across that. If we have some idea what that function is, we can call it something else that makes sense to us. So I went ahead and did that. I mostly, some static kind of by hand find and replace sort of things where obvious obfuscation of variables and function names was done to replace things that made sense to me anyway, and went back and forth a little bit with some debugging inside the FF decompiler. And the result is something that's fairly readable. However, the code assumes that some data is returned from this uncompressed call, and I got kind of stumped there. It wasn't clear to me how that was going to work, how data was going to come to that so that it could be uncompressed, because as it is right there, that returns basically null, which means the decoding doesn't return much either, which means there's nothing really interesting that happens out of this. So maybe there's some data that gets passed somehow to this flash file, and it's in charge of basically decoding and using it. So what I did was I went another step back from the Swift file to an HTM, and there's an index1 HTM file that is used in the sequence of events. I don't actually see where it calls this limit Swift because it's highly obfuscated. We see a DNS request, we see this index HTM, we see the limit Swift, and then we see IE doing some bad stuff. So presumably that's part of the bad sequence of events, but this exploit kit, if that's what it is indeed, is highly obfuscated. And so as you can see here, I've loaded the file into JS Detox and tried to beautify it a little bit, but it wasn't particularly successful, and it wasn't able to run it either. It sort of half decoded it and failed when trying to run it. So what I've got is kind of a half-baked analysis, and I did that on purpose, right? I want you guys to first see the tools in action. I'll give you a quick demo of me using the tools, and then I want you for the exercise to go ahead and finish it. See if you can figure out what the Swift file is really doing. See if you can find a way to decode that ugly HTM file. See if we can figure out what the exploit was. That's the assignment for this time around.